Greetings from Atlantic Council Studios here at the IMF headquarters in Washington, D.C. Throughout this week, we will be providing coverage of the 2024 spring meetings of the IMF and the World Bank Group. I am Amin Mohseni, macroeconomist at the Atlantic Council's Geoeconomic Center, where I lead the Bretton Woods 2.0 project. The project focuses on generating new ideas and perspectives regarding the reform, governance, and operations of the Bretton Woods institutions. As part of our project, we'll be conducting interviews with officials from various international organizations and development institutions, as well as finance ministers and central bank governors from around the world. These interviews will provide deeper insights into various economies and the overall global economy. Today, I'm joined by my colleague, Nicole Golden, a non-resident senior fellow at the Atlantic Council's Geoeconomic Center. Together, we have the honor and privilege of hosting Anna Bjerde, the Managing Director of Operations at the World Bank. In this role, she oversees projects in 130 plus countries focused on poverty reduction, equitable growth, human development, climate change, among other key priorities. Prior to this, she served as Vice President for Europe and Central Asia, leading the institution's efforts to steer the region through a series of overlapping global shocks, including the COVID-19 pandemic and the World Bank's support to Ukraine. An experienced leader with recognized expertise in sustainable infrastructure, she has a strong record of delivering impactful programs across sectors and regions, including Africa and the Middle East. We are delighted to have you here with us, Anna, and welcome and thank you for joining us.
Great to be here. Thank you for having me.
Thank you. So let's kick off our conversation with a brief overview on the global economy, the challenges, the opportunities, some of the blind spots that if we overlook is going to be detrimental for our growth and recovery in the next decade to come.
Well, okay, let's start with that big question.
Yes, it's a long order.
Look, I think we're all very much focused on the global economy and the outlook for the global economy. Because I think what we have lived through and continue to live through are just an incredible amount of crisis and what we call interlinked crisis and risk factors. So if you just look at the fact that we're living through a period of incredibly slow growth, our outlook for 2024 for the world is 2.4%, and for developing countries about 3.9%. And this is just insufficient to get that growth recovery that we need. At the same time, we have all of the threats, which we see all the time, and real events such as natural disasters and climate change. Countries are running very, very high debt levels. We have poverty that is persistent and even on the rise in some countries. And then we have conflict, fragility, and health concerns like pandemics. So these crises are so intertwined, and at the same time, we have basic issues like access to clean air, clean water, and clean energy, still an outstanding agenda to work on. So we really need to double down, and I think this is why it's incredibly important that we come together like this, as we do. It's also why we at the World Bank decided to renew our vision and mission. Again, focusing, as we always do, on poverty reduction and boosting shared prosperity, but adding that livable planet part, which for us is so important because it deals with some of these basic issues I talked about, clean air, clean water, but it also, of course, deals with the sustainability issue. And just to put it into perspective, we don't have time on our side because we have about 1.1 billion people in the global south looking for jobs in the next few years. And as we see it right now, only about 325 million jobs on offer. So we have to double down.
Certainly.
Absolutely. And if I can pick up on that, we're seeing that growth, but we're not seeing it everywhere equally. And in particular, the low-income countries have this high debt, and they are really bearing the brunt of a lot of these challenges and the poly crisis that you mentioned. And so with that, I have seen and heard from you and others a sense of urgency around the IDA this year, the 21st replenishment campaign. And I'm curious to hear, what you think needs to happen differently with IDA this year, and how is the World Bank positioning itself not only to kind of lead on IDA itself, but also with its partners and in the broader development community?
Great question, great timing. We just released today a new report called Great Reversal, which is basically looking at the prospects, risks, and policies for IDA countries. And just to give you three key findings out of this report, which for me are so important to keep in mind. 1/3 of IDA countries today are poorer than they were on the eve of COVID-19. 90% of people who face hunger and malnutrition are in IDA countries, and 50% of IDA countries are either in debt distress or at risk of debt distress. So the outlook for IDA countries is quite serious when we look at the risks and the current situation that they're going through, which is why, again, the IDA replenishment this year is so important to bring attention to the needs of these countries. But it's also because IDA is a really powerful tool, mechanism, funding arrangement. Why? Because IDA does something a lot of funding drives don't do. It leverages. So what we have found in a world where resources are scarce, leverage is the name of the game. So with every dollar into IDA, you're basically getting close to $4 back. The other thing a lot of people don't know is that IDA is the single largest source of climate finance for lower income countries, and pretty much the major source of funding for adaptation. Again, something that is so important in such a contribution of IDA. But what is different and why is it so important this time around? It is because we've seen a lot of very interesting developments around IDA too. We have a lot of countries that have graduated from IDA and have come back as donors. We have a lot of countries who are leaning forward and saying we want to be part of helping to shape IDA, particularly when we think about what the World Bank is trying to do on the Better Bank. We have a lot of interest in simplifying IDA so that the resources through IDA can get to clients faster. Most importantly, I think, is really the global coalition around development. When lower income countries do well, all countries eventually benefit and do much better. Yes. And I think that's the push and the momentum that we need this time around.
It's a really great point. You talk about that coordination and that leverage of IDA and how it's such a key point and a key pillar really of this Better Bank. Another aspect of the Better Bank and evolution and reforms is around just more efficiency really across the World Bank group and its constituent agencies and institutions. It'd be great if you could talk a little bit more about some of the concrete other reforms, whether it's the guarantee platforms or staffing mobility and other ways that you're finding efficiencies and bringing that one World Bank group into life.
Yeah, super exciting. So we're basically skipping pilots and going for new directions at the World Bank. And that, I think, sends a signal that we really want to get results quicker. So some of these new directions is that we really would like the One World Bank group to come through to our clients and partners in a much more clear, responsive and symbolic manner. And for that reason, on July 1, we will essentially have 21 or so new, what we call joint representatives, basically World Bank group country managers. And what they will do is be responsible for all the instruments across IBRD, IDA, IFC, and MIGA. And to me, this is so exciting. And when I look back at my career, I really wish I had had a chance to do this, because getting to know all the things that this institution can offer, I think is just such an opportunity. So what this means for our clients is that you meet with one person. One person will package our response to you. One person will mobilize, of course, with teams, what we can do, but you will not have this fragmentation that we often experience otherwise. I also would very much like to see joint projects going to our board where, one component is IDA and the other component is fully MIGA supported, but it's one project with one objective. I think that's also very interesting. And then most importantly, I'd like this to be the beginning of a scale up like this. So we would like to do more country managers like this, and we also would like to see mobility across our institution. So that's exciting. A second thing I think is exciting is that by taking advantage of the outside expertise through the Private Sector Investment Lab, we've been able to really start thinking, how can we really mobilize much more the private sector to invest in emerging and developing countries? And they've given us some great advice. I think two that really stand out for me. One you mentioned, the new unified platform for guarantees. Again, goes live on July 1. We're already working to set it up. It's going to really position some great guarantee instruments we have across the institution, whether they're IBRD, IDA, IFC, MIGA. Through it being housed in one place in MIGA, we're going to offer our clients a one-stop shop. I think this is very good, and we're already starting to see a lot of interest in this. The second thing is that they've really emphasized something, which is the worst thing for the private sector is lack of predictability when it comes to policies, regulation, legislation. So we have a role to play in our dialogue, in our analytical work, in our policies, to really work with countries to think through what is your strategy for a sector, what is your regulatory regime for a sector or a business process, so, and what is the rule of law and the legislative capacity. And I think this is very helpful for us because we do a lot of reform discussions with our clients. And then maybe on the Better Bank side, one thing we introduced a couple of months ago, which I think is also a game changer given all the risks countries face, is a crisis response toolkit, whereby when a crisis hits, the country can reallocate 10% of their undispersed amounts immediately. And this allows them not to make difficult choices like, do I spend on this or do I spend on that? They actually have access to a significant amount of liquidity when they need it the most. I can talk forever about this, but I'll just stop there.
Well, I mean, it's great to hear that there are so many smaller but not unimportant, and when you add them all up,
and concrete, and quite structural. So that gives me also a lot of hope that it will stick because we're putting structural change in place,
which is important, and for that institutional and bringing it, through the staff and the teams of the bank, and we're starting to see more mobility across the institutions, and that'll help, I think, roll it out. One thing you didn't mention but you did mention results. So the corporate scorecard is another area where we're seeing the institutions come together, going from just released, going from over 150 indicators to 15 with 22 metrics. It's ambitious, as much as it is exciting. So I'm curious to hear what you think might be some of the challenges as you roll that out, and how you're thinking about mitigating those going forward, because it's really an exciting initiative that speaks to everything else.
This is exciting because I think when we first started working on this, thinking A, it's going to be World Bank Group, B, it's going to be around 20 or so of them, C, it's going to be outcome based, I thought to myself, wow, if we can do this, this is just great. And here we are. We actually had it endorsed by our board back in late December. And now we're starting to really, really populate it. So we hope that by June or so we can release the first half or so, and then by the annual meetings the second half, and then we will basically report on it annually. Now, so I think there's huge opportunity here because it will help us. I always say this, if you have a vision and mission, you need to be able to have something that sort of holds your feet to the fire, and to me that's the scorecard. Because you need to translate the vision and mission into what you're trying to achieve more granularly. And in between that, you need the operational processes and the Better Bank to deliver for you. Now, in terms of challenges, I think so far so good, but clearly some of these indicators are new, which means that we actually have to develop methodologies. So we've been in the process of developing new methodologies for a fair amount of these indicators, and we will continue to do so. It's actually been a great opportunity to bring our whole institution together around and get a lot of buy-in and excitement around this. But we've also consulted outside the bank, which I think is helpful because this is where we want to go in the future. And as such, we're taking into account things we didn't look at before, and they're outcome focused. So instead of measuring how many people have access to financial services, we're saying how many people are using it. So how do you then in your methodology need to change how you get to measure these indicators? So I think that will be interesting, getting these methodologies up and running in time for the annual meetings 2024.
2024, and I'm going to pick up on that with one more quick follow-up before I turn it back to my dear friend and colleague Amin. So one of the other, I think, important commitments in the scorecard is the disaggregation, if you will, in terms of, for example, on the jobs indicator, which you mentioned, also looking at the percentage of those jobs for women, for youth, as you mentioned, 1.1 billion coming into the workforce, which is really critical, you and I have talked about this, for understanding where those inclusion gaps are in order to take it forward. And on that, one of the issues that have been around for a long time and the challenges is about gender inclusion. This is something at the heart of the World Bank's work for a long time. We've got a much anticipated new gender strategy came out in last month's Women, Business and the Law report that just closing that legal gender gap, I don't have to tell you this, could increase global GDP by 20%. So it's really critical. What are you most looking forward to in the gender strategy, and what do you think is going to be the real critical kind of mover of it?
Yeah, so thank you for raising that issue. I think for all of us in development, gender equality and gender empowerment is absolutely vital, and we will have failed if we don't make progress on this. And as we have seen, if we follow business as usual, it's going to take over 100 years to close the gap between men and women. No one has 100. I mean, I can't even digest 100 years. So we don't have time. So what we need to do is first and foremost really bring attention to this. And I love to hear people talk about it across our institution, at the IMF, in the private sector, philanthropists. There's a real focus on this, and I think that's good. Secondly, we need to make sure we measure it, which is where the scorecard comes in. So we are really, really set on this disaggregation. For every single indicator, I want to be able to break it down and see, okay, how are we doing on women? And how are we doing on youth? Also very important, but I really want to hold us accountable to whether or not we're moving up on the women's share in terms of getting benefits from the work that we do. On the new strategy, I think it's exciting. We're addressing 3 really difficult issues. And you can ask, why did you pick such difficult issues? Well, we picked difficult issues because that's the business we're in. So to end gender-based violence is an enormous objective. But frankly, it has creeped up. We know that after COVID, and it happens way, way too much in countries around the world. So we need to have it. I'm very supportive of that. And we actually, through experience, tragic experience sometimes, have gotten better at being able to identify risky contexts and find mitigation measures. And then we need to work on policies, legislations, reforms, and women empowerment. And we know you put a woman who has economic empowerment is a lot less likely to be subject to domestic abuse, violence. The second one is very important, which is really to empower women, in a sense, through economic and other services. So what type of services do women need? Access to finance, transport, childcare. So we need to think education. So we need to think, what are those critical services and how do we remove the obstacles of women accessing them? And the third one is really difficult, but I have to say it's really, really interesting, and that is to develop women leadership in the developing world. I think this is fascinating, and I think it can be a game changer. It is not easy to do, but I think there's a lot we can do through the work we do on reforms, on governance, on state-owned enterprise reforms, on privatization, to think about what is the role for women both in the public sector and the private sector, and also in, of course, civil society and academia. So I'm excited about this strategy, super excited about this strategy, and I look forward to really spearheading putting strategy into action.
That's great. Well, we're looking forward to it in the external community because it drives. It's representative of so much of the work we do. Women's economic empowerment is kind of key to how we think about inclusive economic growth at the Council. And your point about the leadership and the governance, when we often say inclusive growth really does start with inclusive governance. And so with that, let me pass it back to Amin.
Sure. When we're talking about the Great Reversal report, I could not stop thinking about the fact that COVID pandemic actually wiped out a decade of progress on gender issues as well. So on that front, I think there has been a great reversal as well, as you just mentioned. Post-COVID, domestic violence issues have risen up. And and wage equality has stalled.
Yes.
Labor force participation rates have stalled as well, declined.
Exactly.
But I really wish you success on that front. It's an amazing initiative. But as we approach the 80th anniversary of the Bretton Woods institutions, and this July actually, what do you think should be the key priorities that policymakers, officials from different countries, from MDBs, IFIs, should keep in mind for the next 20 years, so that when we come back together for the 100th anniversary of these institutions, when we look back, we say we made those hard decisions in 2024, so that we are in this shape right now. So what are some of the key priorities that you would like to point out to?
Yeah, well, first of all, thank you for asking a question on a 20-year horizon, because many times I feel like we're running in crisis mode, so it's nice to take a strategic perspective. So I mentioned growth, and growth is fundamental. I would very much like to be able to look back in 20 years and said, we got growth, we got higher growth, but it was also inclusive and sustainable. Because I think in this world we're living in, we need people to come together rather than apart. And if we don't have inclusive growth, I worry about that. And on the sustainability front, we cannot continue to use Mother Earth the way we've been doing. So we need to think through those actions. That's one. Number two, I would like us to partner more, and we've started doing that. I think, I'm here at the IMF in your studio here. The work we do together between the World Bank Group and IMF, I think, is really important, and our clients want us together because they rely on both of us during difficult times, during medium-term planning times, and they need us to come together and really deliver solutions together. But let me go also to the private sector, and I mentioned this from time to time, that I have really seen the private sector step up and be so innovative in spaces that the public sector just doesn't have the comparative advantage. So research and development, innovation on solutions that both are profit-making but also sustainable. So I think we need to give space to the private sector, and that means removing those barriers in many countries to private sector entering. And I see a lot of that still going on in countries where the entry to barrier for the private sector is too high, or the competitive regulatory framework is completely unconducive for a private sector player to come in. So I really think we need to really work and understand what the private sector needs. And the third one would probably be to come back to this issue of inequality, whether it's gender inequality or it is, if you think about various situations you have within a country, you can have lagging regions, you can have disparities within countries, and I worry about not taking a more comprehensive, holistic view, sometimes in development solutions where we say this is a national program, but let's actually double down and see where are the biggest disparities, because I think inequality will hold us back, and it will continue to create a breeding ground for unconducive avenues in life for young people, lack of hope for young people, and lack of risk-taking also in populations to bet on the future. So those are probably the three things that I would want to look back and say we did something. And then, of course, climate change. I mean, it's yesterday's existential crisis.
Yes.
We must continue to focus on it. And I do feel we've come a long way in recognition, the threat and the existential crisis. We still don't have enough resources for it or coalition as we need to go forward.
Right. So we are approaching the end of our conversation slowly, but I wanted to put out some very quick, short answer questions, if you don't mind, for you. When you wake up in the morning, what gives you optimism when you're facing all of these multifaceted challenges coming to the office?
Optimism I get from the fact that I think we have a lot of young people who need to carry this future, and we need to engage them. So I think about that. I also fundamentally believe that people are good and want good things. So that's when I get up from bed and I go into my first meeting, I look around and I say, this is a group of good people who want to do good things, and that gives me a positive momentum.
Right. Following on your youth point, if you were to give one advice to the young economists working at MDBs, at the World Bank, IFIs, what would that be from your experience working in these institutions?
Go to the countries you're working in and understand them. Because I think political economy, local context, social norms, culture, practices, and then apply your amazing skills, but understand the context you're working in.
What would surprise people to know about the World Bank? One thing or a few things?
Oh, many things. But a couple of things that I think are interesting. One I mentioned, the World Bank is actually, through IDA, but otherwise too, a significant financier of climate action. So in 2022, for example, I think MDB financing was around just over 70 billion. The World Bank was almost 32 billion of that. And the other thing is that we're hugely decentralized. Not everybody knows that in operations that I oversee, over 60% of all of our staff and management is in the field in these countries. Hence my point that in order to be effective, you have to understand and be on the ground.
The local context, definitely. You have
I
anything for the managing director?
Might quickly pick up on that and get in on this rapid fire game with maybe a final question. I know you're immensely proud of the team that you know, is under your purview. What's the superpower? What's the superpower of the team that maybe feeds into that optimism?
You know, I think we have the, you know, when you visit a project and you speak to people who are benefiting from the project, and you see that here's a community that got water, here's a female entrepreneur that figured out a climate smart solution to her small scale agriculture. Here's a set of, you know, a group of girls who are now reading and writing and thinking about their future, and you talk to them and they say, I'm going to be prime minister one day. You know, it's this stuff, you know, seeing the impact on the ground. And you have, that's why I like to get out every 6 to 8 weeks and really see all the good work that we can do, but also identify where we need to pick up the pace or do things differently because those development gains are not yet being felt or realized. Development is a difficult business, but it's a worthwhile, very worthwhile. I would say it's the most worthwhile work to be in.
Well, I couldn't agree more. Maybe that's a good note to end on.
Definitely, yes.
Yeah.
Thank you so much, Anna, for being with us today.
Me.
Today is our first day of our programming for the 2024 spring meetings of IMF and the World Bank. You mentioned July 1st a few times for some of the initiatives. We'll be looking forward to that, and that's of course the anniversary of World Bank's existence as well. So we are looking forward to seeing more coming up from the World Bank on that front. With that, follow the rest of our programming during the week on hashtag Future of Econ, and visit our website at Atlantic Council, Bretton Woods 2.0 Project website for more research and events that are coming up. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.